That's right, woodchuck chuckers, it's Groundhog Day, and to celebrate, I want to take a look at one of my favourite film to musical adaptations. Tim Minchin and Danny Rubin's take on Groundhog Day. This musical has a fascinating production history. It started life over here in London at the Old Vic in 2016, and then moved on to Broadway in one of the toughest seasons we have ever seen, up against Come From Away, Great Comet of 1812, Dear Evan Hansen, and because of this, it didn't really get the awards buzz it really wanted, and honestly, could have gotten another season. Picking up a decent slate of nominations, but not managing to pick up any wins. And because it struggled to find an audience on Broadway, it closed with less than a year on its run. But just like Groundhog Day is all about, we got a little bit of sense of deja vu, because Groundhog Day returned 6 years later to the Old Vic in London in 2023, and then went on to have a season in Melbourne, Australia. Now, this video started as a screen to stage discussion, like I did for Beetlejuice, because I really love how this musical kind of takes the idea and takes the film's outline and reshapes it with its own identity. However, then I watched the Broadway version again, and I was really taken aback at how different and how much it actually changed between Broadway and coming back to London. Despite there being no overwhelming rewrites between versions like we saw with musicals like Addams Family or Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. One day, someday, probably this day next year, we return to the film and explore those changes, but my little ADHD brain could not stop focusing on the musical. So today, we are going to take a look at the Broadway version and the London version of Groundhog Day and discuss what's the difference. But if you haven't seen my face before, hi, I'm Ellie, I talk about theatre. I am the most chaotic theatre person on the internet. I do reviews, I do discussions, I do versus brackets and rankings, and if any of that sounds interesting to you, please consider hitting like and subscribe. It really helps me, it helps out the channel. But let's dive in to Groundhog Day. Now, before we start, just a caveat. To make these videos, I have to partake in the watching of slime tutorials, as the internet would call it. I'm at the mercy of whenever these slime tutorials were filmed. And because live theatre is constantly changing, which is something I love about making this series, there may be more differences that were made to these versions after this was filmed that I simply just have no way of knowing about. I'm lucky to have two versions of the London run, which I think for the most part run exactly the same, and was filmed much later into the London run, so it's pretty safe to say that this was like when it was locked in. However, the Broadway version I'm working off is from previews. I don't think out of the main slime tutorials that people have, there is anything that is filmed after opening. So there may have been more changes to the Broadway version that were made through this preview period. So if you did see it on Broadway, and if anything did change from what I discussed in this video, please do let me know in the comments down below. Now, I think if you watch these two versions of the musical years apart, if you went to see it on closing night on Broadway and then went to opening night in London in 2023, I don't think you notice anything massively fundamentally different with that time gap. On paper, these are the same. Same plot, same structure, same song list, same Andy Carl. But with the journey back to the UK, some things needed to change. On Broadway, Groundhog Day played at the August Wilson Theatre, home currently to Cabaret and previously home to Mean Girls. And this was a very technological show. This show featured 6 revolves. I am going to say throughout this video that there was 6 turntables. On second glance, it might have been 5. I never said I was good at maths. 2 large outer rings which could spin in opposite directions, 1 center ring that could spin on its own, and within that was 3 more revolves, all on that center bit which could turn it all different ways. All of the staging, the choreography, and the set relied very heavily on these 6 revolves. So what happens when you need to remove them? Coming back to the Old Vic on a much smaller stage, they had to scale back again to make sure it could fit in this theatre. And when a whole show has kind of been tooled and staged and set around a certain way of staging, it makes sense that when you have to change this, it will have a knock-on effect on the script too. Because of this, you'll see a lot of changes come just through the nature of practicality when it comes to the London version. In this restaging, they also brought in a new choreographer in Lizzie G, which has a huge knock-on effect on all of the staging. I think this context is important to keep in mind as we start to discuss some of these changes. Because it's not always about what's changed, it's also trying to think why. Is it practicality? Is it new voices in the room? Is it simply just cultural differences between countries and what one country will know more about rather than another? Especially with Groundhog Day, despite being well known from the film, being a cultural holiday specifically for Punxsutawney in the States. With that said, let's walk through this musical and find our key differences. And it's not hard to find the first one, because it's literally the first thing that happens in the musical. Just before the overture happens, we see a news broadcast, a weather forecast, from Phil Connors in both versions. However, this is completely different. The Broadway version consists of outtakes. It's Phil not taking his job seriously at all, and it illustrates his character a lot more. Whereas the Old Vic version is a lot more factual. He's a lot nicer on camera. It's a lot more professional from Phil, which makes sense because he's always an asshole behind the camera, not on. And this version explains the holiday a little bit more, gives you that little bit of context about Groundhog Day, which I assume is more for London audiences who may be less familiar with this tradition. After this, we move on to the overture, and we see our first big change come from the set. As we see the van travel to Punxsutawney. This is done on the Centre Revolves on Broadway, but this is actually put on a track that rolls across the front of the stage in London. This also matches the way that the ensemble enter in this song. Broadway entering from the back, and London entering from the sides. And as you can tell, so much of this is just practicality. It's not different in a way of approach. It's not different in a way of trying to reshape the musical. It's different in a way of not being able to do one thing and taking it in a different way. We then get There'll Be Sun. We see the townsfolk come together to celebrate and get ready for their beloved holiday the following day. On Broadway, there's a stage all around the Revolve. They're kind of clumped together in like this long line around the Revolve, which spins all the way around, and that's the main staging. Without the Revolve, this is actually fairly more stagnant in London. They kind of walk to the front of the stage and just kind of stay there. And all the banners that they're holding feel a little bit less homemade and feel a little bit less personal and characterful in London, especially because there's a switch in who is singing this song. On Broadway, it's all the characters that we're going to meet soon. We meet the crowd, we meet Mrs. Lancaster, we see Jonathan and Debbie and Fred and everyone in this town in their own personal outfits. However, in London, all of the characters here singing this song match the more traditional outfits and the traditional wear of the town officials. Also fun to note, in London, they pause to take a selfie. We then move into Phil's hotel room to start day one. This is a single structure in London, but on Broadway, it forms out of all of these breakable parts, which allows them a little bit more flexibility. But with no Revolve in London, they instead decide to make this one single set piece, which moves along a track and is automated to be able to go round and turn so we can see the back of it. While I do enjoy how this structure comes together, I actually do quite like the simplicity of this one single set. And you'll see in a little bit how this one change has a couple of knock-on changes that I think helps the pace of day one a little bit. And speaking of knock-on effects, day one sets up the cycle, and any changes that are made between versions match the future cycles to come. Because of this, I'm going to have to speak about day one in excruciating detail, just so I don't have to speak about day two or day three very much. So let's do it. Broadway Phil, first of all, takes longer to get out of bed. He lifts the duvet the second he starts singing the lumpy bed, ugly curtains. And we also hear a lot more of the radio show. This kind of punctuates a lot of the moments between Phil's singing and the complaints he has about the hotel room. But London is a lot more sparing with how they use the radio talk show. And because of this, it actually helps to quicken the pace a little bit. Well, it's a shame that we lose some of the, do you think he will see his shadow? The question on everyone's lips, chapped lips, and like the cheesiness of it. But the first huge change to the actual material here comes within the second verse. This is where we see one of the first lyric changes in the show. There's not that many. It's more so the book and the cutting of characters and the staging that changes a lot between these two versions, but they did go back and change a couple of things, including this section in the second verse. London adds an additional section after their dumb superstitions and vacuous chat, where he continues to insult the people of Tactitawny. Reading straight from the script here, he goes, there's total unawareness to the fact that they're trapped. Perhaps you don't miss it. If you don't know, you'll like it. And that leads straight back into where Broadway goes straight into, which is, I'm sure there was a pack of Xanax in this jacket. It's an interesting change, and I actually think it kind of doubled down quite well on Phil's anger and resentment for the people of this town just for, living how they want to live. Phil exits the room and has his first encounter in Tactitawny. Just outside the room in both versions, he speaks to Jonathan. The script is very similar here too. They both feature Jonathan asking whether Phil's going to go see the groundhog, and he mocks him in both versions. However, this is where it changes. On Broadway, he asks if there's literally anything else he can do, like tractor pulling or cow tipping, and Jonathan seems very confused about that. But in London, Phil is a lot more sarcastic about it, and he goes, sure, I'll do it right after the cow tipping. To which Jonathan really earnestly replies, oh, that's not today. However, what comes after happens in both versions, where Jonathan asks Phil whether he thinks it's going to be an early spring, to which Phil bluntly replies, I'm thinking March 21st. Now, on Broadway, after this encounter with Jonathan, it transitions into another room in the hotel. There's a short sung moment where he sings, I'm going to lose it altogether if one more person talks about the weather. And he goes into another room in the B&B where he meets Mrs. Lancaster and two tourists who speak about the oncoming blizzard. London instead merges these two scenes together. This is potentially just to keep the set limited. The way that they achieve the second room in Broadway is taking all of the different parts from the hotel room set and moving them and twisting them around to form this second room. However, with this being one set in London, they can't do that. So it's just more practical to mix these together. Mrs. Lancaster enters the same like she does in Broadway. However, the tourists are cut, and instead Jonathan gets the discussions about the blizzard. Now, say what you want about having to downsize a piece, but with smart book alterations, you can kind of have the best of both worlds, like Groundhog Day achieves here. Mixing these two scenes together not only makes this scene simpler, a little bit quicker to the point, but that also has an effect on all the following scenes, because we don't have to spend as long changing the set going from room to room. We get the gist a little bit quicker, and I feel that that allows the show to get through these cycles even stronger. You'll see a lot of the outline of the day follows very similarly through the two versions. Phil leaves, he encounters a marching band, two members of the marching band recognize him, these are Debbie and Fred, who will be important later, and they ask Phil for a photo, which he obliges to. However, this is just the three of them on Broadway, but in London, actually the entire marching band comes in for the photo, which I think makes for a more interesting stage picture as this scene freezes for a moment. Phil continues to rant about small town people, he quickly gets past the homeless man, and on Broadway, after the homeless man, he meets Ned Ryerson. Whereas London decides to move Ned Ryerson to after the following verse, to be able to shorten the ending of the song a little bit. But despite the different placement, the meeting with Ned runs the same. Ned recognizes him, Phil doesn't. Phil quickly tries to get out of the situation, and in doing so, accidentally gets hit in the head with this giant pole by this man in a groundhog suit. Going into the final section before the groundhog ceremony, the choreography here is completely different. Broadway Phil finds himself in a slight huddle, a long rope is pulled across the stage, and the ensemble members kind of push themselves forward and switch places, kind of like this. But in London, they opt instead for flagography. Flagography here, flagography there. We then reach Gobbler's Knob. Yes, that is its real name. That is not made up for the musical. That is not made up for the film. That is not an innuendo. That is its real life name. where the actual Groundhog Day ceremony happens. It's called Gobbler's Knot. Are you kidding me? And like Phil's room, this has a more defined structure in London. Actually, I prefer this one a lot. The London set for this looks good. The following scene is fairly similar. Phil and Rita meet here. He's extremely dismissive of her. However, there is an extra moment on Broadway where he tries to come on to her. Rita tells him if there's anything she can do for him, just ask, to which Phil responds, anything? And she has to shoot that down very quickly. Dry laughing and just saying work-related. We then go into the actual ceremony, which is a little bit shorter in London as they cut some of the crowd singing. Now, this is very complicated to just speak through, so instead, I've made this handy-dandy chart. Look at this. You can see exactly highlighted the section they cut in London and where they moved the mayor's speech to, which now comes before the crowd sings properly. And then in both versions, the rest of the day runs practically identical. There is one tiny word change. In the diner, Phil and Rita talk, the cops enter, the road get closed down. One thing to note here, however, is that because of the smaller cast in London, there is a character in this diner who is cut and blended into the role of Debbie. This is the second waitress in the diner, Doris, but we'll come back to her later. Later in the bar, Phil meets Rita once more. He's covered in snow, and Phil starts to come on to Rita even stronger, which Rita very quickly rejects to. You want to know what the one change is in this 5-minute section? When two tourists enter the bar, on Broadway, he just very quickly tells them to shut up, and in London, he just yells no at them. The day ends with a solo from Rita, and we head into day 2. Now, as we explore day 1 in so much detail, I can basically just sit here and say that the only real changes here come from the changes I've already discussed. You know, the mixing of Jonathan and Mrs. Lancaster's scenes into one, the band and them all getting into the same picture, and the rest of it follows pretty similarly. Going from emotions of the day, realizing more and more how weird it is that everything's happening again, and becoming too overwhelmed with everything by the time he gets to the diner, and then after that scene going straight to bed, not heading to the bar. The only big change in day 2 from day 1 that isn't covered by me discussing day 1's changes is some more lyric changes. Because of day 1 cutting all of the interjections from the talk show, the Broadway version of this would not work because it's Phil kind of mocking that broadcast. The thing plays again with him knowing what's happening. He uses it to joke around. They're like, what's your prediction? I predict your unemployment. Will Phil see a shadow? Yes, he did. And he has this back and forth with the radio. However, London instead gives him a proper verse here, where he sings, the 3-star review clearly failed to mention the owner showing signs of early onset dementia. One Groundhog Day surely more than enough. Even Hicks must get sick of this stuff. Which I'm hoping is the correct lyric. I'm trying to transcribe here. It's not perfect. I don't have a script. I would really love a script. Tim Minchin, if you're watching this, I will give you my address. Please send me a Groundhog Day script. I'd really love it. Sign it, please. And if day 2 was close, day 3 is even closer, with Phil running through the events, panicking, screaming, and ending up in the song Stuck. He approaches several different experts, whoever he can find, really. And lyrically, the song is the same, bar swapping a reference to an animal from rhino to monkey. Why? I don't know. The best idea I have about why they made this change is maybe because rhinos are more endangered now and they didn't want to make it look like they were supporting poaching with this joke, but I don't know, sometimes a change is just a change. What is massively different about Stuck is the staging. I think the London version is actually slightly stronger in this case. They bring in a screen for the enema, they have the experts interact a lot more, kind of crowding more around Phil, whereas they're kind of in their own sections on Broadway, each doing their own little dance behind their little cart things. Also, while we're here, who needs enemas with friends like these? Still one of my favorite comedic lines in musical theatre history. Genius. 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 It's so dumb, and I love it. I love a bit of wordplay. Tim Minchin is so good at musical theatre wordplay. One of the most underrated musical lyricists of the current decade. Or, I guess, the last 2 decades. He hasn't even written a musical this decade. Tim Minchin, get on that. Phil then, with nowhere else to go, heads to the bar. This scene with the barflies is a lot shorter in London, with them choosing to ditch a moment where Phil interrupts their aimless discussions, and a moment where the pair discuss the Groundhog Day banquet. There's also a slight moment where Phil questions. He asks why he's stuck in this. He seems to think that he's a good person, then he brings people sunshine, in his own words. And as the song starts, the versions follow pretty much one-to-one. They get drunk, which leads them going into the truck and having this giant car chase. Now, obviously, without the revolves, the movement of the car is a little bit more simpler here. It's done on the track, which allows it to spin around and still manages to have a pretty decent effect. And they still do the giant puppets, as for lack of a better word, car chase. But this is slightly shorter in London and gets cut down a bit. Phil is arrested, but wakes up once again in his bed the next day. A full set for the Old Vic, but just a bed and an alarm clock for Broadway. With the affirmation that he can do whatever he wants with no consequences, leads us into the first of 3 instrumental-based day in a life of Phil sequences, as I'll call them. This one is philandering. They all are Phil puns, and I love them a lot. He follows the usual day cycle with the same changes that we've seen from day 1, 2, 3, but now just being an arsehole to everyone. Something additional to note here as well is that on Broadway, in the Broadway version, Phil is a lot more insulting to Jonathan's weight here. But the biggest change to this sequence, once again, as we found with a lot of things, is staging and choreography. A lot of this sequence on Broadway use more suggestions of sets, like they use these door frames that would all spin round and revolve. But London instead decides to bring out more of the full sets. He goes about his day. In London, he adds a Terminator reference when he shoots down the sheriff's holster. But the following things happen in both versions. He socks Ned Ryerson right in the face. He goes to Gobbler's Knob, but instead of actually doing his job, he instead goes and gets information from Nancy, so he can then use that to hook up with her the next day. On Broadway, however, he claims that he is a New York Times journalist. In London, he instead says that he's a correspondent. Through a door in both versions, we hear his late night encounter with Nancy, accidentally calling her Mandy, and there's actually a change to how this ends in both versions. In both, she asks if it's a one-night stand, and he replies, "Ask me again in the morning." But in Broadway, we see an additional moment where Phil actually kicks her out. But the biggest change in this whole section is next. On Broadway, we see this sequence where Phil is getting intimate with a series of different people on this one bed under revolve. Yes, I say people, different genders. Canon bisexual Phil Connors. We love to see it. This is replaced in London by a party sequence. We see the door frame open and more people entering Phil's room. There's also new lyrics here, where the crowd repeat this refrain. They repeat the "who is that, who is that?" And they also sing "tonight we're gonna party like there's no tomorrow." The rest of Act 1 follows fairly parallel. Only minor script changes here. After philandering, we head to the bar, where Rita is furious that Phil hasn't shown up to work. The only difference in this section is that as Phil leaves, Rita shouts after him in London. But now, through the song One Day, Phil is committed to seducing Rita, and we see several days of him trying. The first big change here is how Phil screws up the first day. He actually doesn't in London. But on Broadway, he orders himself a serious drink, as Rita calls it, and he makes fun of frilly lady drinks, to which Rita responds and orders a drink that we saw her order earlier in the musical. A sweet vermouth on the rocks with a twist. The twist being the foot that Phil has just shoved directly into his mouth. And then we go into try number 2. In London, we don't get any of this. We have the same idea. Phil orders his drink, Rita orders hers, but in London he just kind of notes this to himself and goes into day number 2, where this runs parallel now. He continues to refine these cycles, screwing up at the last possible moment. He does this in the bar, then they move on to a restaurant, and then they move on to a scene outside, where Phil gets into a snowball fight with a bunch of kids. Notable to say that on Broadway, this is done on a bare stage. In London, they bring on 2 benches. In another go of this outside section, Phil comes on too strong and creeps out Rita with this obsessiveness and the word love coming out after, well, she's only known him for like less than a day, despite this being a lot longer for Phil. And he's left alone in the snow, thinking back on a past day, wondering why he wasn't stuck there instead. And the song comes to its conclusion as we see the characters of the town that we've been meeting come and say what their one dream is. The only differences here are that Jonathan's section is swapped from an addiction to fried chicken to an addiction to cheese, with lyric changes coming to suit both versions. And honestly, I do think, while I prefer the idea of him having a fried chicken addiction, the lyrics for the cheese addiction work a lot better and the rhyme is a bit stronger. I see why they changed that. And the other change is Doris. Remember Doris? I told you she'd be important later, because she has a moment in this song where she sings very off-key that she would like to be able to learn how to sing. As she's cut in this version, all of her goals and aspirations are given to the role of Debbie. And with such, Debbie sings this moment in the London version. There's also quite a lot of staging and choreography changes here, and I do miss a little bit what they do on Broadway. The dances, these really strong, sharp, short movements that are all done in canon. And then after Phil yells, "What do you know, it's Groundhog Day," we see the cycle happen in reverse, which is a really cool effect that they achieve on Broadway, but because of how difficult it would be to achieve in London, it's sadly cut. And I do miss it. But Act 1 ends in a very similar way in both versions. The alarm clock blaring and Phil smashing it. However, in London, he adds a moment where he screams out, "Somebody make it stop." Now we're halfway through. Can you see what I mean by the changes in this musical? They're exactly the same, but all of these changes just help to either quicken the pace or to allow them to bring this onto a different stage, allowing it to be told in a space that the Broadway version wouldn't be able to be told in. Sure, there's some things I do miss from Broadway. Sure, there's some automation that is really cool in London, but it feels like these changes are made very purposefully. It feels like they're trying to make sure that it still feels very big and bold. Even if when you look between the two versions directly, you can tell that a lot of the London staging feels a little bit more stagnant because of the lack of moving parts. And by moving parts, I mean the floor. Getting back into it, Act 2 opens in both versions with an entr'acte and Playing Nancy. On Broadway, the entr'acte goes straight into Playing Nancy, but we actually have a short reprise of the Punxsutawney Phil song in London, which sees Nancy drop her pom-poms in the middle of it, something that does happen on the daily cycle in London. A moment where she feels slightly embarrassed, so as she goes to pick them up, she goes straight into the song Playing Nancy, which I think is a great change, and actually allows this number to come in more naturally, not kind of feeling like it comes out of nowhere like it does sometimes on Broadway. From here to Hope, the musical follows a similar trajectory. Phil is desperate to lead the cycle, he runs, pulls out a gun, shoots the groundhog, and then brings the gun to his head. And we go into Hope, a phenomenally staged sequence in both versions. The main tricks are the same in both versions. He walks into traffic with a groundhog head, he gets into a bathtub, dropping a toaster in, and he climbs a ladder and jumps off. Every time somehow appearing right back in the bed. However, there are minor changes throughout this to make it work in London due to this smaller stage and the less flexible stage because of the revolves being taken out. How many times have I said revolve in this video? Take a shot every time. London, however, does decide to cut one creative choice from Hope on Broadway, and this is a sequence where several beds are placed onto revolve. They spin around and we see the ensemble dressed as Phil taking their own lives in loads of extra ways that we don't see throughout the rest of the sequence. However, with no revolve and with no good way to get these beds off stage, this has to be cut, as well as the trick of the final bed on stage actually having Andy Carl in it, so he pops out as Phil once more. London instead has Phil climbing up the ladder and a crowd gathering round. And then when Phil drops, Andy Carl turns around and reveals that he was a part of the crowd the entire time. Both versions work extremely well, and I want to give massive props for the staging of the sequence. It is phenomenal. Massive props to the illusion team and the direction for this sequence. We then get the scene where Phil finally confides in Rita what's going on. The iconic scene from the film where he says that he is a god. Not the god a god. This scene is slightly shorter in the London version, as he kind of has a moment of whether or not Rita will actually believe him, and he says that downright to her in the Broadway version, whereas he just kind of comes out with it in London. To prove it, in both versions, he tells Rita about the people in the diner. Now, on Broadway, he starts with Doris, speaking about how she wants to be able to sing, then Fred and Debbie and the engagement, and ends with Jeff. However, with no Doris in the UK version, they slightly shuffle this around. So in London, he starts with Jeff instead, then moves on specifically to Fred to speak about the engagement, and then brings Debbie into it once more, giving the section about Doris to Debbie. Fred's section is all about this engagement between him and Debbie and how he really wants to propose, but he doesn't really want to do it yet because he knows that Debbie wants a diamond. On Broadway, Phil doubles down on this and says, yes, she absolutely does need a diamond, whereas in London, he instead tells Fred to seal the deal. This leads us into Everything About You, the scene that comes afterwards, where, Phil is explaining and going into depth about how this is emotionally affecting him, and goes into the song If I Have My Time Again. Now, this song has changed slightly. Firstly, let's speak about staging, because the staging on Broadway included the ensemble a lot earlier than London does, and more so throughout. It's only really when we get a little bit later into this song in London, when we get to the carnival and the fun fair, where we see the ensemble properly come into it. Oh, and also they make Phil more bisexual in the London version, because instead of saying that he dated one dude when he was bored, he has now dated some dudes because he was bored. Bisexual king! And London cut an extra scene from Broadway that comes in between this, just before they go into that fun fair, where Phil decides to point out a couple of things about the town. He points out a frozen over duck pond, which he says he went skinny dipping in, and points out where he learnt how to drive an 18-wheeler and proceeded to crash it into a store. But the reason I bring this up still is there's one interesting line here. Rita says to him, "It feels like you're showing me your hometown. Please keep this in mind. We'll come back to it later." Instead, the Old Vic heads straight into the fun fair scene. As we head into the fun fair and they all ride on the tilt-a-whirl. On Broadway, they go into different carts, which are placed on the 3 smaller revolves, and are automated on the track in London. In London, they share the cart, but on Broadway, they go into different ones. And in London, this is the first scene to use the string lights. It's an extra addition to the set for London, where they come down and the ensemble kind of grab them and move them out of the way to add extra lighting to the scenes, specifically this fun fair and later on at the banquet. Towards the end of the song, there's a couple of fairly large changes to the score. Both versions feature Rita saying that she would love to learn piano, and Phil responds, why? In the Broadway version, she continues into, and I'd make a lot of friends if I had my time again, which always kind of felt strange. She never really responded to Phil's question there. London rectifies this by retooling that final verse, actually responding to it, saying that she'd just give everything a try, and she would make a lot of friends, with Phil singing the revolving ride section in between it, which creates the rhyme as well. And London changes the ending of the song to be a lot softer. Broadway ending with a long-held note from Rita, and having this kind of large ending. However, the change to the score and the lyrics here ends with Rita having a new section, which culminates with the lyrics, "Try to have more days that end like this." Is it less impressive vocally? Sure, but I actually really like this genuinely sweet moment between the two, as they find themselves back at the end of the day in Phil's B&B room. The following scene runs the same, with Rita trying to stay up until 6 a.m. to see Phil disappear, but once again, the day cycle resets. But now Phil has a new lease on life, bringing us into the second day in the life of Phil sequence, Philosopher. The only one of the 3 not on the Broadway cast album, which is a real shame because these orchestrations are beautiful. Old Vic adds a performer saying, "Will you see a shadow? Won't you see a shadow? Come and see Tonyville," before the sequence starts. And there's an additional added harmony underneath for the Old Vic scene, as he goes about his day as usual, but now being a little bit nicer to people. And again, like day 1, like day 2, like day 3, like philandering, the day sequence follows similar changes between the versions. The Jonathan meeting script is the same in both versions, but the change to Mrs. Lancaster means he goes into a different room on Broadway, and he leaves telling them to have a great day. The next scenes match fairly well. He offers now to take a photo with Fred and Debbie instead of them asking him. He catches the holster that the sheriff drops, and in the Old Vic, he adds an extra line where he says to himself, I'll see what I can do about that. He says hi to Ned and accidentally socks him in the face and is very apologetic and says it's a force of habit, and finds out more about his family and his late wife. And he actually decides to go with Ned. Now, being on the opposite side of where the groundhog swings the pole, he finally doesn't get hit, which is a really lovely moment and a really sweet way to show Phil's growth and how the changes in the cycle that he makes have positive effects on the world around him and positive effects on his experience of it as well. A really great piece of direction, especially when you realize that this is something that is changed specifically from the film. As this one thing is one flub in the scene in the film is him slipping on the pavement. He goes to his job, his broadcast, and Larry, the cameraman, and Rita are very surprised that he brings coffee and donuts for everyone. Larry's reaction line is slightly different from London to Broadway. Phil tells Larry that he's realized that they never really speak, which Broadway Larry responds with, I think you forget I'm here, and Old Vic Larry responds with, well, you never brought me a donut before. Getting towards the end of this sequence and going into Night Will Come, we see Phil taking up piano lessons, and we go back and forth between that and him meeting and trying to save the life of this homeless man. This homeless man is someone who he meets throughout the daily cycle, with him giving his wallet over completely to him during Philosopher. But this isn't enough to save his life. And he struggles with, even though he has this immense power, he has this ability to relive the same day over and over again, he can't actually save this one man. This scene is slightly restructured when it came to London. Obviously, first of all, the staging is different, with the piano on one side of the revolve and the homeless man on the other, and the stage just keeping in this ongoing cycle, with Phil following the motion between the scenes as the piano becomes the front of the stage, and then the homeless man becomes the front of the stage. Without the revolve, they stage this stage left and stage right at the Old Vic. But there is one extra scene in the sequence which isn't on that bench or at the piano, and that is Phil bringing in the homeless man to a doctor's ward, to a hospital, and he has this interaction with a nurse. On Broadway, this happens before the song. It happens as part of the piano sequence. But without a good way to get the piano off and then bring it back on for when it's needed later, or get the bench off and bring the bench back on, they instead decide to bring this into the middle of the song, swapping it with a moment that happened during Night Will Come on Broadway, where Phil brings the homeless man soup. Meaning that they get to keep it between these two scenes before the song starts and are able to get the piano off stage so they can have a space for Phil to properly meet with the nurse. And actually, I think swapping these two scenes adds additional weight to what Phil's doing. There's almost more of an escalation of it. Now, realizing that he's dying, realizing that he's dead and he's too late, bringing him soup and thinking that might save him, but it doesn't, and then actually taking him to a hospital. There's more of an escalation to Phil's actions there. Then on Broadway, where it feels like it kind of goes like that. After Night Will Come, we head back to Gobbler's Knob, and Phil gives a very hopeful monologue. This is the same in both versions. However, there is a slight difference when Phil goes to do some errands, as he says. The scene here is slightly longer on Broadway. As Rita questions why he's doing errands, Phil responds with, yeah, why wait? And he gives a short French quote. Now, I do not speak French. I will place what he says right here.
Où sont les neiges d'antan?
Thank you, French automated voice. According to Google Translate, which is not always perfect, what this translates to are, where are the snows of yesteryear? And Rita, kind of taken aback, responds with, you know French poetry? And Phil heads into the countdown and runs off. In London, when Rita questions why he's got errands to do here, he says, you'd be surprised, and goes straight into the countdown. Now, to show you how much has changed in this one sequence, this is the final Day in the Life of Phil instrumental sequence, I have written 2 whole pages of notes. I have 2 full pages of notes just on this one sequence. So I'm going to try and do this as quickly as humanly possible. First, let's speak about the changes to the actual good deeds that he does. And yes, I am going to do this reading from the book. There's too much here. Now, a lot of these good deeds do match, but have slightly different ways of staging them. He helps a couple fix a tire on their car. On Broadway, he rolls this across the stage silently, But in London, he's carrying it under his arm and yells out for them, "Stay right there, I got ya." After this on Broadway, he helps a sneezing tourist. But with the tourist being cut in London, this is now gone and goes straight into the next good deed, which is the cop. This plays out exactly the same. The holster drops, Phil picks it up and accidentally points the gun at him. The sheriff turns around, sees Phil pointing the gun, to which Phil very quickly goes, "No," pulls out a new holster, puts it in, and attaches it to his belt. The next good deed is a man choking on what I think is a hot dog. This is Jonathan in the UK, but on Broadway, this is the other tourist. The UK version also adds additional lines here, where Phil shouts out, "Buddy, buddy, buddy, here you go," as he does the Heimlich on him, and Jonathan shouts after him, "You just saved my life." Next in both versions is Mrs. Lancaster, but what Phil does for her is different. On Broadway, he gives her a bunch of snowballs, which she throws at some kids, and in London, he buys her a new coffee machine. And after this on Broadway, you get an exclusive good deed, as this giant cubicle rolls onto the stage and Phil casually Kobe's some toilet paper into the stall, to which the person inside gives a big old thumbs up. Instead, in the UK, they go straight into Phil's next good deed, which is helping a woman give birth. This is done with a woman in a wheelchair in London, but they bring out more of a proper bed structure on Broadway. And then after these good deeds, he once again meets Rita on the benches. Both versions playing out the same. Phil runs in, very out of breath, gives Rita some chili, and very quickly hears a bell toll and has to run back off. There is an interesting change here because on Broadway, Rita stops him before he goes and is able to thank him for it face to face. However, Phil in London runs off too quickly and Rita just shouts it after him. We're into the next section. Phil's got some more good deeds to do. The next good deed is the same, but is staged very differently. We see Phil save a cat from a tree. On Broadway, they bring out this ladder and Phil saves a woman from falling off of it and then catches a cat as that falls from the gods straight into his arms. In London, there's no ladder, it's just a woman pointing upwards, and Phil pulls out this fishbone, which brings the cat down from the tree. And the final good deed of the song in both versions is Phil helping someone to sing. As previously mentioned, this role is given to Doris on Broadway and Debbie in London. Now, you see how that was a lot? That's just the good deed changes, because choreo and lyrics are just casually completely different. On Broadway, this is a full instrumental. The only, lyrics, for lack of a better term, are the crowd kind of giving the odd, what, or a woo, or a cheer. Whereas London adds a lot of additional lyrics. Now, I was trying to listen to the recording, but these lyrics were very hard to make out with the track, and because the sound just wasn't amazing on this recording. So unfortunately, I can't really give you a lot of what they're actually singing, but I did manage to transcribe some of it, because these sections play through the song pretty consistently. The first change is really easy to make out. The song starts with this counting. They go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That exists on Broadway, but in addition in London, they add some extra lyrics underneath that. As the crowd repeats, "There is no town greater. There is no town greater. There is no town greater than Puxatawny on Groundhog Day." All of these additional lyrics seemingly are sections of different songs. One of these, they repeat some of the lyrics from There Will Be Sun. "Oh, if I could, I'd will these clouds away. I'd wave my hand, reveal the stars. Oh, if I could, I'd hold it tight at bay." The section after that, I couldn't make out because it sounded like something new. And it goes into this section where they repeat on and on and on and on and on and on. There's also a section where they add in some lyrics from Nobody Cares as well. Not sure what the point is, but the point is it don't matter. And the final sequence where they add a lot of extra lyrics into it, when they pull out the drumsticks. I couldn't make out many of these, but I did hear them saying, "You gotta love life," which refers back to the motto that Ned sings when he meets Phil. And then this then goes into them singing, "If I had my time again, I would not do it all the same," referring back to "If I had my time again." The final verse, however, the final section, matches Broadway, as that is the only section that Broadway has that had lyrics, which is them doing a reprise of the Puxatawny Phil song. Would you believe me if I said we're still not done? Because choreo, this sequence is completely restaged. I've touched on a few little pieces of it through the good deeds, but the choreography is completely different as well. Both feature a lot of tap. It's very tap-based, and the tap is great in both versions. Instead of telling you everything that's different, because I'm not amazing at describing choreography. I'm just going to walk you through some of the moments that I picked up on that I miss or I liked from both versions. Broadway obviously uses the revolve a lot more. The ensemble kind of tap their way around the revolve as it spins them around the stage. I actually really like the Broadway intro as well. It's a section where they're all kind of popping up and going in different directions as the countdown rolls on. It looks really good, and with the lighting as well, it's a moment that I kind of wish they still kept. And there's a lot of moments on Broadway where Phil joins in, even if just for a brief moment to get from one side of the stage to the other, but it kind of has a way of showing him becoming a part of the town, which I feel like is missing. I feel like it is missing for the Old Vic. Despite this, I think the Old Vic has some great moments as well. They add this drumstick section where each of the ensemble members have 2 drumsticks in their hand. They're drumming the floor and hitting the drumsticks on each other and smashing it together. It's really, really well choreographed there. I like a lot of the clock motif that they add in. There's a lot of like clock hands that they're doing. It's cute. There's also a lot of shivering. They're very cold in London. And I'll speak about the ending of both at the same time because I like what they do in both. Broadway ends with the ensemble going towards the back. The bar has now been set up in front of them and they throw up snow, which falls straight down onto them. It creates this really beautiful image. Whereas London, the ensemble come towards the front and Phil just pulls out a confetti cannon straight out into the audience. It's very cool. Would I like the confetti to be white though in London? Yes, but that is nitpicky. But then again, what is this series if not nitpicky? I am literally nitpicking and going through the tiniest little changes known to man. Who else has gone through this musical in this much detail other than literally the people who wrote and made these changes? Back at the bar, Rita reacts to the town people coming in and showing how they have been affected by Phil. This runs the same in both versions except one slight change because of Phil's difference of what he does for Mrs. Lancaster. Mrs. Lancaster enters and says on Broadway that Phil actually fixed her old coffee machine, but in London, he buys her a new one. There's also a costume difference for Larry because the good deed that Phil does for Larry is picking out a new shirt. This shirt is different in both versions, with it being a little bit more, tacky? Yeah, let's go with the word tacky. It being a little bit more tacky in London. But Larry seems happy with it in both versions, so, you know, who cares about my fashion opinion? And then we go into Punxsutawney Rock, heading towards the end of the musical in the final set piece, the banquet hall. Now, on Broadway, Punxsutawney Rock is performed by the piano teacher. However, this is now given to Debbie in London. I really like this change because I feel like it gives a little bit more summation to Phil helping her. You know, he's been given this opportunity to play piano at this banquet. It kind of makes sense that the person he's helped to be able to sing sings this song. There's also an interjection moment that happens in this song, as it's technically a reprise of the Punxsutawney Phil song, but with different orchestrations and a more rockier sound. The moment where they ask, is it a squirrel, is it a beaver, is performed by different people in either version. On Broadway, this was Jonathan and Mrs. Lancaster. But over here in London, it was given to Larry instead of Jonathan, with Mrs. Lancaster still joining in on the second one. And the script for the scene follows exactly the same. The only difference is now, when they bet on Phil, it's different people betting. They're betting to have a dance with Phil Connors. On Broadway, this betting war happens between Doris, Nancy, Debbie, and Jeff. And in London, this is Mrs. Lancaster, the tire lady. I refer to her as that because she is the lady that Phil helps change her tire. Tire lady. And Debbie and Jeff, who actually match in both versions. The actual bets themselves, exactly the same. And it ends in the same way, with Rita coming in with a very huge overshot bet. And leading into Seeing You. Now, the song itself, the same. But there is a moment in between the song where Phil and Rita go to this observation deck. First things first, the obvious thing is bringing us into this scene. The actual observation deck is set at the back of the stage and is brought to the front by the revolve on Broadway. With no revolve, this is brought on by 2 ensemble members in London, with the scene being hidden behind them by the string lights. Now, the things that Phil points out are slightly different in both versions. On Broadway, he points out the public toilets, and in London, he points out a garbage truck, which gets the exact same response from Rita in both versions, which is, oh, sweet. In the Old Vic version, next is when Phil points out the public toilets. But on Broadway, Phil actually points out a guy vomiting, to which Rita responds, no he isn't. And very smugly, Phil responds, yes he is. And we hear this drunk man yell out, go Penn State! This is one of the few scenes that the Old Vic version actually extends. Do you remember I told you to keep in your mind a certain comment that Rita made in If I Had My Time Again? In the Broadway version, she mentions that it feels like Phil is showing her around his hometown. This comment is moved here, as Phil continues to point out different things about the town. He points out the high school, he points out Miller's Duck Pond, just doesn't mention anything about skinny dipping this time. And also mentions the ice cream shop. And here Rita responds, it's like you're showing me around your hometown. I love this placement. I think this placement works so much better because I feel like this comment is a much bigger summation of how much Phil has grown. I like its placement originally, but I don't think in that placement Phil has learned yet. He's not yet committing the good deeds. He's not yet doing these things. He hasn't really grown accustomed to this town yet. And I think especially as this is the final loop, this is the final day of the loop, it's very important to have that moment and to really show and underline Phil's growth, which I think moving this line does very well. And then we go into the final song section of Seeing You. The snow falls heavily in both versions, and we go back into the chorus. On Broadway, we see a lot more of the town people dance. It's pretty much everyone on Broadway. But in London, we see a couple of the couples that have formed. We see Fred and Debbie dance together. We see Nancy and Larry, who I haven't mentioned, but actually start to form a connection throughout the different time loops. And Mrs. Lancaster on her own, spinning in the middle of them. And then in both versions, we go into February 3rd. Phil slowly realizes the loop is broken. Rita re-enters the room from the shower. And the script here is the same to the very end. Phil and Rita decide to stay one more day in Puxatawney, and they go and see the sunrise. The only difference here comes in staging. In London, Phil gives Rita his scarf, and on Broadway, he helps her with her coat. When they leave the room and go and see the sunrise, a lot more of the ensemble is actually on the stage, and they slowly leave to leave the final picture of the musical being Rita and Phil on that bench. That picture still stays in the Old Vic version, but the ensemble never enter. And through this, the musical ends with the same picture. And that is as many changes between the Broadway and the London versions of Groundhog Day that I could find. It's so interesting to me because fundamentally, these are the same. The changes are minor. The only huge things are staging, choreography, a couple of lyric tweaks, but I think what it does is it quickens the pace a lot. I think especially for a show that is as repetitive as Groundhog Day, you want to set up things as quickly as possible. And a lot of the changes they made in London have made it so that this cycle gets off to a quicker start. There's a couple of things I missed. There's moments of choreography, moments of staging that I do think are massively helped with the revolves on the stage. And I think as a general note, I do think the London staging is a lot more stagnant in places. They use the ensemble a lot less, and I feel like you do feel that when you're watching both versions side by side. But nonetheless, I feel like in London they made good changes. And I think it's interesting to look back at them and see how even small things can change a lot about a musical. But what do you think? What is your favourite change that Groundhog Day made from Broadway back into London? Let me know all your thoughts on this in the comments down below. And let me know any future musicals that you would like to see me do a What's the Difference on, or a stage to screen on. I really want to do Addams Family, but I can't find footage of the pre-Broadway run. If I could find the pre-Broadway run, I would be doing Addams Family next. I need Addams Family Chicago. Does anyone have Addams Family Chicago bootleg? Please. If you did enjoy this video, please consider hitting like and subscribe. It really helps me out, helps out the channel. Here's some links to some other videos on screen right now, and a link to my Instagram you'd like to give me a follow over there. I also have other social links and a merch store in the description down below. But that's it for me today, and I hope to see you next time. Bye.